We don't always know those we love the most as well as we think we do. Sometimes the greatest secret of our lives is right there, sleeping between the walls we call home. And that's exactly what happened to Andre. Throughout his childhood and youth, he felt that there was something hidden in his father's past, a silence that no gesture of affection, no demonstration of love could explain. Most people would have ignored it, let it go. But destiny, which loves to turn lives upside down in search of dormant truths, had other plans. Imagine discovering, years after the death of someone you loved, that the person who was by your side every day wasn't exactly who they said they were, that they carried a secret burden, built on choices made with courage, humility, and a painful need to protect what they loved most. That's what Andre faced, and what he found inside an old, locked box was something that not only changed his story, but also changed the way he saw the world, humanity, and the true meaning of honesty and the power of kindness. Get ready, because this story will stir your deepest emotions. It will make you rethink what you know about your own bonds, your judgments, your certainties. Sometimes what seems like a betrayal is, in fact, the purest act of compassion and altruism. So stay with me until the end, because I guarantee Andre's revelation will make you see life with completely new eyes, eyes of someone who understands that true love, the one that transforms everything, often hides between the lines of what was not said. From a very young age, Andre knew that his father, Ottavio, was different from the other fathers he knew. He was a man of few words, with a gaze that often seemed to sail in distant seas, far beyond the walls of the house where affection and respect always overflowed. It wasn't that there was a lack of love. On the contrary, Ottavio was present, kind and affectionate in his gestures. But there was something there, a peculiar silence, a shadow that hovered without being named. Sometimes during conversations about childhood or youth, Ottavio would look away, change the subject, or simply become silent, leaving Andre with the seed of curiosity, but also of understanding. As Andre grew older, that itch behind his ear also grew stubborn. He tried on several occasions to get some clue from his father, a story from school, a childhood friend, a funny memory from his adolescence. But all he received in return were vague smiles and loose phrases, as if Ottavio was afraid of opening old wounds. That absence of a past, that dense fog surrounding his father's origins, was a mystery that pulsed between them, but that Andre, through kindness and empathy, learned to respect. Maybe it was just a trauma, maybe a hidden sadness, and he thought, and who was he to judge? Still, as he matured, Andre felt that there was something more, something that was not just sadness or shyness, but rather a deep secret, a story hidden under layers of courage, humility, and loneliness. Without realizing it, these silences also shaped Andre. They taught him to look at the world with resilience, to value what was said and even more what was kept quiet. And little did he know that one day he would have to gather all his trust and hope to delve into Ottavio's past, a past that would change not only his perception of his father, but the entire way he saw his own life. The day Andre decided to clean his father's old house was, from the beginning, heavy in a way he couldn't explain. Every object, every piece of furniture covered in dust seemed to carry echoes of loneliness, gratitude, and an infinite longing. As he walked through the rooms, he felt he was touching not only belongings but memories that were so silent they almost whispered. At the end of the hallway, behind a low, half-jammed door, Andre found the stairs that led to the attic, a space that until then no one had mentioned. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and courage, he decided to go up without knowing that up there his destiny awaited him. The attic was a world apart, a universe forgotten in time, where the past seemed to breathe silently beneath the layers of dust and silence. The wood creaked beneath his footsteps, as if complaining about the interruption, and the air, dense and still, carried a sweet smell of antiquity, mixed with a faint aroma of mold and mystery. Old boxes were piled up in unstable piles, covered by sheets stained by the seasons that had passed, silent witnesses of a time that would never return. Each step Andre took was a dive deeper into a sea of hidden memories, where each object seemed to contain an untold story. Moved by a serene, almost childlike, hope of finding something that would fill the gaps in his father's story, he searched carefully, as if touching the fragments of the soul of someone he had loved but never fully known. There was respect in every gesture, as if he were afraid of disturbing a secret sanctuary. It was then, in a dark corner, half hidden behind a broken chest, that something caught his attention. Under a worn blanket, there lay a heavy, dark wooden box, reinforced with old ironwork. A rusty padlock sealed it, as if it held a precious, perhaps dangerous secret, and although it was quiet, the box seemed to emit a silent call, a soundless whisper that said, "Here is the truth you have always sought." At that moment, something inside Andrei changed, a premonition, a spark of dormant wisdom. Andrei's heart began to beat faster, each pulse echoing in his ears like a ceremonial drum. He felt a whirlwind of emotions clashing inside his chest: fear, inspiration, insecurity, and a deep curiosity that would not let him retreat. That box, strangely alive, seemed to contain not only objects but the essence of a buried past, perhaps forgotten on purpose. With trembling hands, he tried to pull it out, but the wood resisted, as if it had taken root in the ground over the decades. It was as if the box itself was fighting to keep its secrets intact, protected from time and truth. Amidst the shadows and dust, Andrei felt small, like an intruder in a story that wasn't his, or that perhaps was more his than he imagined. He took a deep breath, remembering the values his father had always cultivated, such as honesty, understanding, and humility, and which now seemed to be reconfigured under a new light. That moment was a turning point. Something told him that, upon opening that box, there would be no going back. He would cross an invisible threshold, a point of no return where reality could be undone and reassembled from a new perspective. And despite the fear, there was also a strange peace, the certainty that even if it hurt, he needed to know. He needed to look history in the eye and understand, with all his being, who Ottavio was: the man, the father, the mystery. Forcing the padlock with an old wrench found in a dusty corner of the attic, Andrei felt cold sweat slowly run down the back of his neck, mixed with the tension that was building in his shoulders. Each metallic click of the tool against the rusty iron sounded like thunder in that sacred silence, as if the past itself was bravely resisting being unveiled. The box seemed to hold not only documents, but layers of pain, silence, and truths that had never been told. With a final effort and a dry snap that reverberated deep in his chest, the padlock gave way. The lid creaked with a deep, almost funereal sound, revealing its contents with solemn slowness. Inside it, time rested. Old letters, folded with care, faded documents, black and white photos in which smiles and looks carried the weight of history. Andrei immersed his hands there with the same care one would touch a sacred relic. It was like touching his father's soul, like coming into contact, with hidden layers of affection, gratitude, and an almost poetic melancholy. The smell of aged paper mixed with that of ancient wood, and each item seemed to have been placed there with the intention of one day being found. At that moment, Andrei was not just touching old things, he was beginning a ritual of reconciliation, of connecting with a past that needed and deserved to be known. And even without understanding everything, he felt that there was something greater inside than he had expected. The chance to reconstruct not only Ottavio's story, but also his own identity. However, not everything there was sweet or comforting. Amidst the gentle letters and photos filled with affection and tenderness, elements began to emerge that weighed on Andrei's soul, like stones thrown into a calm lake. Old newspaper clippings, their edges fragile and yellowed by time, emerged like specters from the past, bringing with them disturbing headlines: unsolved crimes, controversial trials, reports of mysterious disappearances. The printed letters seemed to pulse, as if they were still alive. With each new line read, the cold of insecurity invaded Andrei's chest with force, squeezing his heart in a knot that was difficult to untie. His breathing became short, heavy, as if the air in the attic had become thin. And then, amidst the papers, came the cruelest blow. An old identity card with his father's photo, but a different name, a different past. That revelation struck like a bolt of lightning, shattering into 1,000 pieces the solid image he had built for so many years. Who was Ottavio, after all? Was he really a criminal hiding under the mask of a loving father? Or was there another, deeper truth there, hidden by layers of fear and need? The questions multiplied like labyrinths, and André, astonished, felt the world spin around him. Nothing seemed right anymore. It was as if the ground that supported his own story had begun to crumble, taking with it not only the image of his father, but also the certainties of a whole life built on trust and unconditional love. The initial shock gave way to a deep uneasiness, a silent murmur that spread inside like waves in a newly stirred lake. André could barely process what he had in his hands, but something inside him, stronger than fear, urged him to move forward. It was as if compassion had made its way through the confusion, offering him a more human perspective on all of this. Maybe, just maybe, there was a coherent explanation for that false name, for the obscure details. Deep in his heart he wished, with an almost childish but sincere hope, that his father would not be the monster suggested by the headlines. He had always seen in Ottavio a man of silent wisdom, of simple attitudes, but full of the power, of kindness. He remembered the patient advice, the silent hugs, the tired eyes that at times hid an unnamed sadness. Could this be the weight his father carried in secret? It was impossible to ignore that trunk was not just a pile of memories. It was a portal, an invitation to the truth. And this truth, however disconcerting it might be, cried out to be understood with resilience, perseverance, and humility. André knew that he could not continue living in the comfortable ignorance he had before. Fate had placed him there, in that forgotten attic, so that he could finally face the past. And even without knowing what he would find at the end of the journey, he was willing to move on. Because sometimes the only way to honor love is to face the pain head-on. André spent hours staring at the documents scattered across the attic floor, as if he were trying to decipher an ancient enigma. Time seemed suspended, as if the world outside had stopped spinning so that he could delve into that discovery. It was hard to accept that the man he had called father his entire life was hiding an entire past, with another name, another story, other ghosts. The ground beneath his feet no longer seemed solid. It was like walking on quicksand, where each new memory unearthed made his own identity more fragile, more diffuse. Who was Ottavio? And more importantly, who was he, André, if part of his history was based on silences and secrets? He began to remember details that had previously been insignificant, the distant look in his eyes on rainy nights, the evasive answers when he asked about his father's youth, the moments when he seemed absent even though he was present. Suddenly everything made sense, a painful but real sense. Sitting there surrounded by papers, photographs, and the echo of memories never shared, André felt his own essence begin to fragment. It was as if part of him had been built on an incomplete truth, as if he were finding himself again in pieces. And in this painful reunion, what sustained him was love, what he had received, what he still felt, and what he wanted to understand. Because even in the face of insecurity and disappointment, there was something stronger, the desire to understand, to rebuild, to reconcile. It was tempting to give in to anger. André felt the hurt creeping into the corners of his mind, whispering questions as sharp as daggers. Why did he lie? Why did he never trust me? How many times during his childhood and youth had he heard sermons about the importance of truth, honesty, about living with courage and integrity? And now all of that seemed to have been built on a foundation of omissions. The resentment threatened to grow, but there was also deep down a soft voice that asked for silence, a voice that asked for understanding. Maybe there were bigger reasons, deep pains, difficult choices that Ottavio had had to make when he was still young and vulnerable. Maybe hiding the past was his way of protecting himself, not out of shame, but out of love. André remembered the times when his father supported him in silence, the firm hugs on sad days, the way he would wipe his tears without making a fuss, with kindness and affection. That couldn't have been a lie. It was real, authentic. And then the anger began to give way to something more difficult, but infinitely more noble: empathy. Because to truly love is also to be able to look at the other person with less judgmental and more human eyes. It was a silent internal battle between the impulse to accuse and the conscious choice to forgive. André understood, for the first time, that the deepest stories are not linear. They are made of shadow and light, and sometimes those we love also carry secrets that have nothing to do with distrust, but with the desperate desire to protect. With a heavy chest and a boiling mind, André made a decision that was not born of impulse, but of the visceral need to understand. It was more than curiosity. It was a calling from the soul. He needed to go beyond assumptions, beyond the fragments scattered on the attic floor. He needed to honor not only the memory of the man who had raised him with so much love and respect, but also himself, his thirst for truth, for reconciliation. He knew that what he would discover could change everything. The way he saw his father, himself, even his own life. But he also understood that true wisdom does not flourish in comfort. It is born from the courage to dive into the abyss of doubt, to face what hurts with open eyes. He put the most relevant documents in his backpack, with an almost ceremonial care, like someone holding the map of an ancient journey. It was the beginning of a journey that would require more than physical strength. It would require resilience, perseverance, and humility. As he descended from the attic, each step seemed to mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. A cycle of silence ended, and another made of searching and revelation opened before him. André did not know what he would find, perhaps more pain, perhaps some unexpected form of peace. But he knew, with the deepest certainty of his heart, that he was no longer alone. He carried with him the strength of those who truly love, of those who choose to understand rather than condemn. And that was enough to keep going. With the documents carefully kept close to his chest, André left the attic behind, but not the weight of what he was carrying. He felt a new energy being born within him, forged between hope and responsibility. Now that he knew part of the truth, he could no longer be content with loose pieces. He had to put the puzzle together, follow the trails that Otavio had left, even if they were fragments faded over time. He decided to start with the cities mentioned in the newspaper clippings, and each new destination was like opening a forgotten door. The trips became a mixture of anxiety and discovery, a mix of tension and fascination. With each new landscape he saw from the bus or train window, André felt that he was getting a little closer to the center of that story. With humility and perseverance, he knocked on the doors of old registry offices, where the archives smelled of overstored paper and of dusty libraries that seemed to have stopped in time. He talked to elderly people whose memories still held glimpses of a past that the world had forgotten. In each trembling voice there was a story, sometimes clear, sometimes ambiguous, that added new layers to the enigmatic figure of his father. And even in the face of uncertainty, André maintained the faith that there, among those little visited routes and among words spoken with caution, he would find more than answers. He would find parts of himself. Because this search was, above all, a way of telling Otavio, wherever he was, that his silence had not been in vain. In each new face a clue. In each forgotten corner, a shadow of the man Otavio had been before he became just father. André listened to the stories with reverent attention, as if picking up the pieces of an old soul. Some stories surprised him. They spoke of a happy, dreamy young man, full of life and generosity. Others whispered about a tragedy, a dark event that had torn him from his hometown and thrown him into a destiny of silence and escape. As the stories intertwined, André learned to listen beyond the words. He learned to notice the silences, the lowered looks, the sighs that said more than 1,000 sentences. It was as if each person who spoke of him knew him through a different prism, and each prism revealed a facet that his son had never had the chance to see. With each step of this journey, the figure of Otavio ceased to be a distant idol and became something more real, a fallible, complex human being driven by difficult choices. André began to see in him not only the father he had known, but the man who had fought in silence, who had loved discreetly, who had chosen anonymity to protect. And it was in this process that he understood, with empathy and respect, that past mistakes are not always born of evil, but of a desperate attempt to do the right thing in the face of chaos. With each revelation, he felt closer and more responsible, because understanding Ottavio was also understanding himself and everything, that love and silent understanding are capable of building even in the dark. This search was no longer just about his father. At this point, Andrei clearly realized that he was looking for a reflection of himself in each city he visited, in each face that mentioned Ottavio. His father's story mixed with his own, like two currents that meet in the same river, forming invisible but deep roots. Each new discovery not only filled in gaps about the past, but revealed forgotten pieces of his own essence. He finally understood that we are not made only of what we inherit. We are also shaped by the truths we have the courage to discover, by the lies we decide to forgive, and by the memories we choose to transform into learning experiences. Even in the face of fear, insecurity, and the silent pain that surfaced, Andrei felt that the journey made him more whole. It was as if, by looking at his father with more human eyes, he was learning to look at himself with more love and kindness. With each step, he gained more resilience, more awareness of the value of forgiveness and the power of kindness as transformative forces. Something inside him, even if timid, began to blossom. The certainty that the truth does not destroy, it liberates. And even if that truth was imperfect, tortuous, full of scars, it was authentic. And authenticity, even when it hurts, inspires. It inspired Andrei to move forward, with a new perspective on the past and with an open heart for what was yet to come. The pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together the day Andrei met a silver-haired lady whose presence exuded wisdom and understanding. She welcomed him with a soft smile and teary eyes, as if she already knew who he was before he even introduced himself. Sitting on a simple porch, with the aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the sweet smell of the garden flowers, they began to talk. The words flowed with the necessary slowness of someone reliving old memories. She had known Ottavio, or rather the young man he had been before he disappeared from the world, with another name and another story. She spoke of him with affection, but also with a regret that time had not erased. And then, between sips of coffee and long sighs, she revealed what would change everything. Ottavio was not a criminal, as the newspapers insinuated. He had been involved unintentionally in an unfair, cruel situation that forced him to disappear to protect those he loved. He was the victim of a setup, of a confusion that put him at the center of a scandal with no chance of defense. His escape was not cowardice. It was an act of altruism. He abandoned everything, friends, dreams, roots, to ensure the safety of those around him. Andrei listened in silence, feeling his heart ache with each detail. The image of his father as a silent hero began to take shape, not perfect, but deeply human. And with each new word, the story transformed from pain to understanding, from doubt to revelation. The shock of the revelation was as intense as the emotion that welled up in Andrei's heart, flooding him with a bittersweet mixture of sadness and admiration. Sitting there, in front of that lady who spoke with a choked voice and teary eyes, he imagined with pain what it meant to abandon everything: family, friends, identity, the small rituals of routine. Ottavio had lived in constant fear, watching every step, every word, every expression, as if walking through a minefield. All of this in the name of a single purpose: to protect. Andrei felt the weight of this sacrifice in every cell of his body, and at the same time, an immense gratitude. The father he had known, so restrained, so attentive, had been much more than he seemed. He was not a perfect man, nor was he a saint, but he was someone who had chosen love above his own freedom, who had chosen to live a life of renunciation to guarantee his son a safe existence, free from stigma. It was a story of pain, yes, but also living proof of the power of goodness, silent, discreet, but absolutely real. Ottavio did not seek applause or public redemption. He did not want recognition. He just wanted his son to grow up in peace. without carrying the burden of a mistake he never made. And that, for Andrei, was more moving than any speech. At that moment, he understood that true heroism often hides in the shadows, in acts that no one sees, but that shape entire lives. And that silent love had always been the invisible thread that guided him. As he reflected on all that, sitting on the bench of that simple porch, Andrei felt something deep inside him break, not in pain, but in revelation. He finally understood that Ottavio did not only carry the weight of an unjust past, but also the serene courage of someone who faces the storm without ever expecting a reward. The father he had known, so often silent, so often distant, was the same man who had chosen emotional exile to protect his son from shame, fear, and persecution. That distant look he had seen so many times during silent dinners or lazy Sundays now took on new meaning. It wasn't coldness, it was longing for what had been left behind. It was contained pain. It was love suffocated by the need to remain firm. By hiding his story, Ottavio didn't try to erase who he was, but rather to spare Andrei from a burden that didn't belong to him. And in that gesture, there was resilience, emotional honesty, and a humility that was deeply moving. Suddenly, the figure of his father gained another dimension. No longer a man who deceived, but a man who endured, who kept quiet not by omission, but by compassion, who loved not with words but with silent actions. Andrei felt this vibrate within him, as if every cell in his body recognized this truth that had been denied for so long. And with that realization, he knew that there was still much to discover, and perhaps much to forgive. Among the relics stored in the old box, already carefully reorganized in the silence of his room, Andrei found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded red ribbon, almost undone by time. The texture of the paper was fine, sensitive to the touch, as if each page carried not only words but a raw and urgent feeling that had withstood the decades. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, he began to read them one by one, as if reading ancient sacred prayers. And there, in the crooked words and the hesitantly crossed-out passages, Ottavio finally revealed himself completely. The letters were not just messages. They were confessions of a man who lived in hiding not out of cowardice, but out of fear of losing what he loved most. Each line carried affection, sincerity, a deep sense of regret, and above all, overwhelming guilt. "I wanted to tell you so many times," said one of the first, "but I always feared that the truth would take me away from you." It was impossible to read them without feeling a lump in my throat. Ottavio wanted, with a moving strength, to open his heart to his son, but he hesitated between the duty of truth and the fear of rejection. He was afraid of losing the trust, the unconditional love that he had seen in Andrei's eyes since childhood. These words revealed not an idealized hero, but a real man, with flaws, fears, and yet with an overflowing compassion. And this, for Andrei, was like hearing his father speak from a place beyond absence, beyond time. It was finally the reunion that he so needed. Ottavio's words cut like soft blades, not because they were cruel, but because they were too true to go unnoticed. With each sentence he read, Andrei found himself between tears and sad smiles, like someone looking back on life with more mature, more human eyes. One of the letters in particular disarmed him. "I know I wasn't perfect, my son. I made bad choices in the hope of doing the right thing, and every silence, every lie was made thinking about your future, and not about my pride." It was impossible not to be moved by such dedication. Andrei realized, with a sweet tightness in his chest, that even in the most painful decisions, his father had chosen altruism. He had chosen to carry the weight of guilt, fear, and loneliness alone, so that he, his son, could walk freely. And there was something deeply moving about this gesture. Ottavio never sought to justify himself, nor to be forgiven. He only wished that one day, if the truth were to come to light, it would be understood with the same love with which he had lived each renunciation. Andrei felt this between the lines, the power of kindness impregnated in each word written, hesitantly, as if someone were writing with their heart in their hands. And as much as it hurt to discover that so much, as he closed the last letter, with his hands still damp from his own tears, Andre felt the real weight of that silence that had lasted for years. He was not just a father who had made mistakes trying to get it right. He was a man who, with resilience, love, and humility, had given up his own story, his own name, to build a new life around that which he considered sacred, his son. And at that moment, while the paper rested on his knees as if it were still pulsating, Andre understood that he had received a legacy much more powerful than material inheritances or surnames. He had inherited the silent example of someone who chose to love in silence, even under the shadow of pain. Between silent tears and his hand clutching his chest, as if trying to contain the overflowing of his soul, he understood the true meaning of gratitude. He was grateful not only for the life he had, but for the courage his father had had to ensure that it was possible. And it was in this spirit, not of anger or judgment, but of profound reverence, that he decided on the next step. He would not just seek more answers, he would seek forgiveness, not as a moral obligation, but as an act of liberation for both of them. It was time to let go of the weight that no longer made sense to carry. It was time to allow love, with all its silent strength, to restore the broken bridges between the past and the present. And so, with a lighter heart, Andre began to glimpse the possibility of walking in peace, not by forgetting, but by understanding. For Andre, the process of accepting the truth was like crossing a dense, dark forest, where each step required more than courage. It required a heart willing to shed its pride and look humbly at human fragility, his own and Ottavio's. There were no shortcuts. There were no ready-made formulas for digesting everything that had come to light. Sometimes he would wake up with a clouded mind, as if he were trapped between two worlds, one in which Ottavio was just the firm, present, discreet father, and one in which he was also a man who suffered, who fled, who made mistakes while trying to get things right. It was painful to reconcile these two versions. But little by little, as he revisited memories with new eyes, the anger that had previously threatened to set in began to give way to compassion. A mature compassion that sprang from the recognition that no one lives without scars, and that, often, the greatest acts of love are done in the shadows, far from the spotlight. Andre learned through this intimate dive that forgiveness is not a gift offered to others, but a bridge built within ourselves, an act of wisdom, a liberation of the soul, a conscious choice not to allow the pain of the past to define the future. And with each step taken in this emotional forest, he felt more whole, more prepared to live with ease, to move forward with more truth, to love with more depth. Because in the end, that was what Ottavio wanted, for his son to have a free heart. There were times when the pain seemed to win, when the weight of the discoveries returned to haunt Andre's nights like insistent echoes. Memories that were once sweet became uncomfortable. Interrupted conversations, questions never answered, prolonged silences that now took on new and painful meanings. In many early mornings, Andre would sit on the edge of the bed with a heavy heart, his eyes lost in the darkness of the room, trying to find meaning in it all. It was as if he were mourning, not for his father's death, but for the death of the image he had built of him throughout his life. Even so, in those dark moments, he clung to the letters, to the sincere words that Ottavio had left, to the silent affection that overflowed even between the lines. And, little by little, he began to understand that true love is not measured by the absence of mistakes, but by persistence in the face of failures. That loving someone also means learning to accept their imperfections, their painful choices, their poorly explained fears. When he decided to forgive, he did not do so with fanfare or grand speeches. It was an intimate, solitary, almost sacred moment, a silent conversation with his father, who could no longer respond but who would certainly feel the forgiveness vibrating beyond time. And in that moment of surrender, Andre understood that forgiveness was above all a gesture of freedom, a gesture of love for himself, for Ottavio, and for everything he would still build with this new awareness. The day that Andre finally visited Ottavio's grave was marked by an atmosphere of almost sacred emotion, as if time had slowed down there just for that meeting to happen. The sky was overcast, but a gentle breeze caressed his face with the delicacy of a fatherly gesture. He did not bring expensive flowers or rehearsed words. He brought only himself, whole, wounded, healed in parts, and his heart free of resentment. He knelt on the cold ground and silently gave thanks. He was grateful for the life he had, for the care he received, for the nights when Ottavio cradled him even as he suffocated his own pain. He was grateful for the silent strength he had inherited, for the wisdom transmitted in small gestures, for the constant kindness of those who chose to love even when afraid. And at that moment, in front of the simple tombstone, he felt that something inside him was realigning. He finally understood that true hope is born when we are able to transform pain into strength, longing into drive, and the past into fertile soil to become better. It was no longer the son who sought explanations. It was the man who recognized in his father not a myth, but a deeply dignified human being. André touched the tombstone with his fingertips as if he wanted to convey a final affection, a final word of reconciliation. And with tears in his eyes, he stood up, feeling that he had completed a cycle. He was ready to take the next step, to rebuild Ottavio's memory with the dignity he deserved, now sustained by truth, love, and deep understanding. Determined to honor his father's true memory, André dedicatedly immersed himself in a new purpose, to reconstruct, with his own hands and words, Ottavio's story, not as a man unjustly accused, but as an upright human being marked by difficult choices and a life shaped by love, altruism, and silence. He gathered the letters, documents, and yellowed photos that had survived decades, preserving fragments of a forgotten truth. Each line written in his notebook was more than a record. It was an act of reverence, a gesture of affection and reconciliation. When writing, André did not seek to defend his father or transform him into a hero. He wanted above all to show the world who he truly was. An imperfect man, yes, but who lived with a kindness that did not ask for recognition, with a wisdom that manifested itself in looks and silences, with a rare emotional honesty, the kind that chooses the good of others, even at the cost of his own suffering. As he wrote, he felt that he was also healing his own wounds. It was as if by giving voice to the father he had silenced for so long, he was also finding his own. His hands sometimes trembled as he recounted the hardest passages, but his heart was firm, because telling this story was a form of liberation, a gesture of justice and love, and above all, a commitment to the truth that had finally come to light, clean, courageous, deeply human. With the manuscript ready, André decided to organize a small, intimate ceremony, not to celebrate the pain, but to share the light that had emerged from it. He gathered his closest family members, some of Ottavio's old friends, those who were still alive, and some people who, along the way, had helped him put the pieces of the past together. There were no formal invitations, no rehearsed speeches. There was only a sincere desire to unite hearts around truth, memory, and forgiveness. The ceremony took place in a peaceful garden under the shade of ancient trees, as if even nature wanted to welcome that moment with tenderness. It was not a funeral nor a traditional celebration. It was a gathering of souls around a story that needed to be heard. André read excerpts of what he had written, his voice choked but full of purpose. When he spoke about his father, about the sacrifices he had made, the letters he had left, the gestures of silent love that defined his life, the people wept in silence. Not just sadness, but understanding, emotion, and empathy. Some laughed, as they remembered curious episodes. Others were moved to realize how little they had ever truly known Ottavio. It was a moment of collective healing, where each tear seemed to wash away not only sorrows, but also the harshness with which the world so often judges what it does not understand. And there, amidst shy hugs, whispered words, and knowing glances, André felt something profound blossom, gratitude for having had the courage to retell the story with love and dignity. At the end of that day, when everyone had left and the garden was empty, André remained there for a few minutes, watching the sky change color. A serene silence enveloped him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something rare, peace. It was not a peace made of complete answers or absolute certainties, but of the kind that arises when we accept life as it is, imperfect but full of meaning. He knew that by retelling Ottavio's story, he had not only rescued the image of a man who had been wronged, but he was also perpetuating a greater lesson about the power of kindness, resilience in the face of pain, and the depth of understanding. That simple ceremony not only cleared his father's name, but also purified the hearts of all who participated. It was as if, by bringing to light a truth that had been stifled for so long, he had lit a flame of hope, not only for himself, but for all who carried secrets, guilt, or unspoken hurts. André understood, with inspiration, that the truth, even painful, has the gift of liberating. And that by sharing that story, marked by affection, sacrifice, and love, he was offering the world not only a story, but an invitation to empathy. A silent call for others to look at their own stories with more kindness, with more humanity. He knew that the path to get there had been difficult, but now he was certain that even in the darkest shadows, there is always a possibility of redemption, healing, and a new beginning. As he closed the old wooden box for the last time, with steady hands and teary eyes, André felt a subtle, and at the same time profound, change within himself. It was not just the end of a search, but the conclusion of a sacred cycle of truth, reconciliation, and love. There was a lightness there that did not come from forgetting, but from the full understanding of everything he had experienced. He understood with sharp and serene clarity that Ottavio's true legacy was never in the objects he had kept, in the photographs, or even in the letters. It was in the silent choices he had made, in the nights when he kept quiet so as not to hurt anyone, in the days when he carried the weight of the past alone so as not to burden his son. It was in the small gestures, the blanket pulled without André noticing, the constant presence even when words failed, the firmness of someone who faced the world with hope as a shield and humility as a shelter. Ottavio had lived without applause, but with a rare courage, the kind that is not taught in words but transmitted through gestures. And that was the true treasure, the love that did not need to be said to be felt, the power of kindness that crossed generations in silence. When he put the box back in the closet, André did not lock it with sadness, but with a deep sense of reverence, because now he knew his father's story did not end there. It continued in every choice that he, André, would make from that moment on. André began to walk differently through the world. It was not something visible at first glance, but there was a subtle, deep-rooted change, as if someone were carrying a new center within themselves. In every gesture of kindness toward a stranger, in every choice made with integrity, he felt accompanied by an invisible presence, that of Ottavio, now no longer a distant or painful figure, but as part of his very essence. It was as if he had inherited more than memories. He had inherited a way of being, a lens through which to see life. He began to realize how much love manifests itself in the simplest of actions, in listening attentively, in forgiving sincerely, in extending a hand even without guarantees of return. And it was in this daily practice, between ordinary tasks and unexpected encounters, that he felt, with renewed intensity, where his strength came from. It came from that hidden history, from that silenced father, from that transformed pain. It came from the resilience he learned by facing his own ghosts with empathy, and from the honesty that guided him to live coherently, even when no one was looking. André no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. He no longer sought explanations or external validation. He knew deep down in his soul that all he had to do was live with righteousness, respect, and love. And in doing so, he would be honoring Ottavio's silent legacy every day. A legacy made not of grandiose words, but of true gestures. Not of visible glories, but of the power of kindness transmitted from father to son. André's life was never the same again. The wound of discovery, once open and pulsating, had turned into a scar, the kind that cannot be hidden, but becomes a symbol of overcoming. The pain that once consumed him now served as a source of inspiration, and the void left by the missing answers had become space for new questions. Questions that did not require urgency, but contained within themselves the wisdom of someone who had learned to accept the mysteries of life. André began to see the world with different eyes, more attentive to the pain hidden in other people's smiles, more sensitive to the silent battles that everyone carries. He understood that we are all made of stories, the ones we inherit, the ones we hear, and most importantly, the ones we have the courage to discover. And he understood deep down that as long as he carried Otavio's invisible legacy in his heart, his father would never be absent. Because true love does not die, it only transforms. It manifests itself in everyday gestures, in words spoken with tenderness, in choices made with awareness. It pulses in compassion, blossoms in forgiveness, echoes in hope, and perpetuates itself in every act of kindness. And that is how Andrew decided to live from then on, not as someone who seeks perfection, but as someone who chooses day after day to walk with an open heart, because he knew, now with absolute certainty, that the roots of true love are invisible, but deep enough to sustain an entire life. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about how many important silences there are in your own story? How many questions have you failed to ask for fear of the answers? How many glances have you avoided? How many words have you swallowed? How many feelings have you silenced? Sometimes we carry invisible boxes inside us, locked with padlocks of pride, pain, or forgetfulness. And perhaps, just perhaps, the greatest act of wisdom is precisely having the courage to open them. Not to relive the suffering, but to allow truth, understanding, and empathy to illuminate what was once shadow. Because there is immense beauty in discovering that behind every silence there can be love, fear, longing, and humanity. That no one is made only of successes or mistakes. We are all made of complete, complex, sacred stories. Think, what legacy do you want to leave for those who love you? A legacy of distance, guilt, and distrust? Or a legacy of love, truth, courage, and forgiveness? Life is made up of choices that almost no one sees. Small, seemingly insignificant, decisions that profoundly shape who we are and what we leave in the world. Perhaps the greatest proof of greatness is not in living without making mistakes, but in making mistakes with dignity and choosing, even after falling, the path of reconciliation. And the power of kindness. If this story touched something in you, if it brought a tear to your eye, a lump in your throat, a forgotten memory, then don't let it die here. Let it be a mirror, a starting point, a seed planted in fertile soil, ready to blossom into real gestures. Because that's what life is transformed into, the actions we take after being touched by something true. That's why I invite you to continue with us on this journey. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and walk alongside us through stories that not only move you, but teach, heal, awaken, and liberate. Here, we believe that growing up is not a solitary act. That evolving, reflecting, and learning about love, compassion, and the power of kindness is a collective adventure, and infinitely more beautiful when shared. Let's unearth memories together, listen to silences, open old boxes, and build, step by step, a more sensitive, more human, more truthful world. Because the best stories are those that don't end with a full stop, but with a transformation.